Hey everybody, Billy Obenauer here, continuing our lessons on Noe and colleagues' Fundamentals of Human Resource Management. In this lesson, we'll be covering Chapter 15 of their book, Collective Bargaining and Labor Relations. Labor unions are organizations that are formed to represent their members' interests in dealing with employers. Unions help to give employees power when dealing with their employers because while a single employee may not have much power, when working together, a collective body of employees does. A great example of this comes from Major League Baseball in 2022. The Players Union was negotiating for several changes, including increased minimum salaries. In other words, they were fighting for the worst players to be paid more money. Now, individually, the worst player on a team has little power because they can easily be replaced. But when the players as a whole advocate for benefits of the worst player, that player's interests don't get lost. That is how labor unions benefit employees. Labor relations is a field that focuses on understanding how organized labor and management can work together to meet the needs of both the employee and the organization. This field studies a variety of factors related to organized labor, including negotiating and administering labor contracts. Now, often we find that organizations are resistant to union activity. And to understand this, we're going to think about this from a profit standpoint. We're going to look at this circle here, and I might refer to it as a pie here and there, but this circle represents the profits within the organization before paying for labor. All right, now we're going to add our labor into the mix, and you see our employees are going to take up a portion of those profits here, and we're going to draw a little line from the edge of the employee circle to the edge of the company circle, and that line just kind of represents the difference in profits here, okay? It represents profits that the company retains after paying for employees. All right, so now we're going to move forward and we're going to look at what this circle looks like after we add unions into the mix, and you see what happens is the unions make the employees more powerful and they're able to grow their share of the profits. All right, so we're going to make a little mark here and we see where our line was before, and if we box that out, we can see kind of a difference here. This yellow line here represents essentially what the employer lost, what the company lost as a result of the employees becoming more powerful in negotiations. And that illustrates why organizations are very often resistant to union activity. All right, so if we want to find a way to coexist between management and unions, what we need to do is we need to find a way for unions to help the employees grow their share of the pie, or their piece of the pie, so to speak, in terms of what they earn, while management doesn't necessarily give up much. So we have to figure out how to grow this pie, how to make the organization more profitable as a result of collaboration between management and unions. The two primary types of unions that you may be familiar with are craft unions and industrial unions. And a craft union has members that have a particular skill or occupation. Okay, so we often see craft unions based upon plumbers, electricians, steam fitters, things like this. So the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers is an example of a craft union, and if you were looking at the local chapter, it might be the local electric and then a number after it. Okay, if you saw that, that would be an example of a craft union. Craft unions are often responsible for arranging apprenticeships and providing different types of training for its members. Okay, then we have industrial unions where people are linked by their work in a particular industry. So communication workers would be part of the same union, but maybe people with different jobs within that industry are all part of that union. Now, most of the unions that you'll see out here, probably about 55% of them are affiliated with the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO is itself not actually a union, but it's an organization that helps connect unions and advocate for unions. And the most important job of the AFL-CIO is actually advocating for public policy changes. So the AFL-CIO historically has had an impact on different laws that are related to unions. The largest union in the United States of America is the National Education Association, and at the time of this recording, the NEA has over 2.7 million members. While we often hear a lot about national labor unions in the news, much of the most impactful work being done by labor unions is happening in the local chapters. Local unions are negotiating and enforcing contracts on a daily basis. From a procedural standpoint, members elect their local officials and have the right to vote on specific resolutions, such as a strike, but local officials will often engage with the organization on the members' behalf. For example, the union steward is a locally elected official who represents members by ensuring that the employer properly honors the labor contract. Despite some of the benefits that employees can realize as a result of union membership is declining in the United States. Some of that is because HR practices and government regulations have made unions less necessary. For example, if the FLSA requires employers to provide overtime pay, employees don't need unions to advocate for overtime compensation. You'll notice that membership has stayed steady in the public sector, but most of the overall decline is driven by the private sector. This is due, in part, to changes in the structure of the economy. Public organizations, such as federal, state, and local governments, aren't replaced in the market. Private organizations are. As private, non-unionized organizations grow, the percentage of private sector employees who are union members decreases. For example, the growth of companies such as Walmart, Google, and Amazon, who have historically not had strong union representation, has influenced the decline of union representation in the private sector. As mentioned on the previous slide, union membership in the public sector has remained strong over the years. And part of the reason for that is that there are government regulations and laws that support the rights of government workers to organize. Even so, however, labor relations is different with government workers than it is in the private sector. Okay, there are restrictions that can prevent federal and state workers from striking, and there are often local restrictions that can prohibit strikes by police officers and firefighters. Even teacher strikes are restricted in many states. And the reason for this is because these laws are put in place to ensure that society can still function while labor relations and negotiations take place. As we discussed earlier, organizations worry that labor unions will cut into their profit margins, but experts have conflicting views on the impacts of unions on organizational performance. Part of the reason for this is that research reflects average impacts of unions, but often doesn't isolate specific effects. Many believe, however, that carefully managed labor relations can positively influence organizational outcomes, and there's some intuition behind this. Earlier in the course, we talked a lot about how motivating work and job satisfaction can influence performance. Well, when labor unions and management can agree on contracts that increase motivational components of work and have a positive impact on satisfaction, these contracts should lead to positive impacts on the organization. To understand labor relations, it's really important to try to understand the goals of those who are involved in the process. For management, their primary goal is to increase the organization's profits, and often they see one pathway of doing that by keeping labor costs low while increasing output. Okay, and to keep labor costs low, they view themselves as being in a position where they're responsible for limiting the increases in wages and benefits, and often trying to recover costs and benefits. All right, we're in a time where benefits costs are increasing and there are questions over who's going to incur those costs. Is it going to be the employer or the employee? And managers are often trying to push more and more of that cost onto the employees. Okay, they also want to retain control over work rules and schedules. If they need to make scheduling changes or they need to switch shifts, they don't want to have to go back to the negotiating board with the labor union. All right, and then finally, managers want to maintain flexible operations. Okay, and what that means is they don't want to have rules in place that prevent them from moving people within the organization or prevent them from changing the way work is done. They want to be able to adapt to the marketplace and adapt to the market how they need to adapt without having to get approval of the union. The labor union has a different set of goals. They want to ensure that compensation and working conditions are in line with what their members expect. They also want to give their members a voice in decisions that are going to impact them. All right, labor unions want to make sure that members link their membership with better compensation and benefits. Now, sometimes when they do this, that means compromise, okay? And that compromise can result in a two-tier wage structure. And what happens here with a two-tier wage structure is that we may have one compensation structure in place, and that compensation structure may be higher than what the employer is comfortable with. And the union has to work to protect that. Okay, and while they're working to protect that, though, they may agree to a different compensation structure for new hires. So new hires may not be brought on under the same structure that existing employees are, and that's where we have a two-tier wage structure. Okay, and then finally, labor unions want to make sure that they have a regular flow of new members. Okay, if they don't have new members, they're not going to survive. And we do have to remember that the labor union itself is an organization. Okay, and if they don't have new members, they're also not going to have quite as much power in negotiations. Okay, now when we look at all the other points that we spoke about earlier in terms of working conditions, compensation, etc., these are all related to this regular flow of new membership. So for the labor union, it's very important that members and other employees who may not be members view the labor union as being connected to these other outcomes here, because if they view the labor union as being connected to these outcomes, it's a lot easier to get people to join the union. The union is also going to advocate rules that help to protect its interests. Okay, and one of the ways that it does this is through a check-off provision. A check-off provision is a rule where the union actually collects its dues through the employer, as the employer will deduct union dues from the employees' paychecks. And this helps the labor union ensure that it's actually going to get paid by its members. All right, so when a labor union can negotiate for a check-off provision in the contract, that's something that they find very beneficial. Okay, the labor unions also interested in how they can maintain membership security. Okay, and basically with membership security, what they're trying to do is they're trying to find ways to ensure that people become members of the union. All right, one way to maintain membership security is through a closed shop. A closed shop is a situation where people need to be a member of the union before being hired by the organization. Okay, now as of the National Labor Relations Act, closed shops are no longer legal in the United States of America. But what employers can put in place, what unions can negotiate for, is a union shop. And in a union shop, somebody has to become a member of the union once they're hired. And typically they're given 30 days to join the union. Now another alternative here is an agency shop, and this is where employees don't have to join the union, but they will have to pay some sort of dues in order to benefit from what the union negotiates. Okay, and then finally there's also maintenance of membership provisions that basically say that once an employee joins a union, they have to wait a certain period of time before they can exit the union. And what all of these points over here on the right are designed to do is they're designed to help ensure that people stay in the union and address what we call a free rider problem. And the free rider problem is where the union is doing work to benefit the employees, but not all of the employees are paying into the union. Labor relations activities don't take place in a bubble. They take place within the framework of our society. So societal goals are highly relevant to labor relations. But societal goals aren't always complementary. For example, people value fair wages and benefits and other factors that employees are more likely to gain when they have strength in numbers. But they also value their own personal freedom and independence. All right. Similarly, people value low-cost healthcare and they value high-quality healthcare. As you can see, not all of society's goals are complementary, but they create the framework within which labor relations activities occur. Much of the power that labor unions have in the United States of America comes from the National Labor Relations Act. The NLRA protects employees' rights to organize a union, join a union, go out on strike, and even refrain from activity on behalf of the union. Now, most employees in the private sector are covered under the NLRA in the United States, but there are a few exceptions. For example, supervisors, an employer's children, and agricultural laborers are all not covered under the NLRA. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 amended the NLRA, stating that unions cannot attempt to harm employers by physically preventing people from going to work, engaging in violence, or threatening employees physically or threatening them with loss of job. The act also gave states the ability to pass right-to-work laws that make union shops, agency shops, and maintenance of membership illegal. The Landrum-Griffin Act gave employees the right to nominate candidates for union office, participate in union meetings, and audit the union's financial records. As you can see from this map, as of 2018, the majority of the states in the United States of America have some sort of right-to-work laws. Okay, you'll see when we look at states without right-to-work laws, they tend to be clustered on the West Coast and in the northeastern United States. The National Labor Relations Board is the federal agency that is responsible for enforcing the NLRA by conducting and certifying representation elections and preventing unfair labor practices. If an organization is violating the National Labor Relations Act, the National Labor Relations Board is the agency that is responsible for addressing that. Now at this point, you might be wondering, how do unions actually get into organizations? Well, it starts with union representatives contacting employees and seeing if there's an interest in bringing the union into the organization. And if there is, then employees are invited to sign what's called an authorization card. All right, and if 30% or more of the employees sign an authorization card, the process can continue. If more than 50% of the employees sign an authorization card, then the employer has the opportunity to just voluntarily recognize the union. And if the employer says, yes, we'll voluntarily recognize the union, the National Labor Relations Board will recognize this, and the union organization process will essentially be complete. If the employer does not agree to voluntarily recognize the union, or fewer than 50% of the employees, but more than 30% of the employees sign authorization cards, then the National Labor Relations Board is going to conduct a secret ballot election. And what this means is that employees are going to vote on whether or not to bring a union into the workplace, but it's going to be a secret ballot, so nobody's going to know who any individual employee voted for. Now, there are two types of elections that can be conducted here under secret ballot. First is a consent election, and this is where the union, the employees, and the employer agree on a time and location for the election. If the union and the employer cannot agree on a time and a location, then the National Labor Relations Board is going to have to determine the time and location of the election, and they're going to conduct what's called a stipulation election, meaning that the NLRB has stipulated when and where the election will be taking place. As a manager, if you hear that there's potential for union organization in your location, the first thing that you're going to want to do is report this up chain. Now, it might be embarrassing to report to your boss that your employees are thinking about organizing a union, but what would be even more embarrassing would be for your employees to organize a union without you ever discussing it with your boss. Okay? When it comes up, you also want to carefully state the company's response to pro-union arguments. And you want to make sure you say things that make sense, but also be consistent and avoid threats and promises. But most importantly, do all the things that are going to take away from the need for a union. Okay, so if you're taking care of your people, they're not going to have a need to organize. So if you're concerned that there might be some union activity starting in your organization, you need to make sure that you're paying careful attention to how you're taking care of your employees. Now, here are some behaviors that you need to avoid if you hear about union activity in your organization. As a manager, you cannot threaten employees if they join a union. You can't threaten employees if they organize a union. You can't interrogate people. You can't ask a bunch of questions about how you feel about the union or who's involved in union activity or when the next meeting is or where it's taking place or any of these types of things. You shouldn't promise people favorable terms if they refuse to join the union, And you most certainly cannot spy on your employees and try to gain information about the union. Earlier we talked about email surveillance. You cannot be reading through people's emails or anything like that to try to learn more about union activity. Union organizing incorporates a variety of strategies that are designed to increase the union's likelihood of being successful. For example, organizers will often call or visit employees at home or outside of the workplace to talk about issues. This helps keep the focus away from unions in the workplace, and it helps make sure that management has less awareness of potential organization. Right? Unions can also offer something called an associate union membership. And this is available in situations where the union is unable to actually organize. And what they'll do is basically provide different types of discounts and things of that nature to employees who want to join a union but don't have an opportunity to organize a union within their workplace due to a lack of support. Unions can conduct corporate campaigns where they'll put a lot of public pressure on organizations that helps give the union a greater likelihood of being successful in organizing. And they can also incorporate certain provisions into a contract, negotiate employer neutrality and card check provisions for future organizations. So when the union organizes in one location, they may try to negotiate into the contract that the employer will not fight the union organization in other locations, or that the employer may even agree to a card check provision, whereas if a majority of employees in another location signs a card, they won't hold an election, but the employer will voluntarily recognize the union. But unions aren't always successful, and sometimes employees want to exit the union. The Taft-Hartley Act expanded members' rights to decertify the union, and decertification takes place when an organization that has a union has that union disbanded. Okay, and in order for this to happen, 30% of the employees must petition for a decertification election. Now, you can't petition for a decertification election while you're under contract. It has to be done 60 to 90 days prior to the expiration of the current contract. Okay, but if you get 30% of the employees petitioning for a decertification election, the NLRB will hold a decertification election. Now, if the majority of the employees vote against the union will be decertified and will no longer represent the employees. Assuming that the union is not decertified, however, as a contract nears its end, the union will engage in what's called collective bargaining with the organization. And what this means is that the union and different representatives of the organization's management will negotiate to try to reach a new agreement on a contract that will meet the needs of both sides. Typically, these contracts will be very extensive, and they'll include basic factors such as provisions for pay, benefits, work rules, resolving grievances, but they'll also include very detailed components that are typically specific to organizations. Now, the contract that you see on the screen here is a teacher's contract. This particular contract is 67 pages long, but some union contracts are over 300 pages long. That's how much detail they go into. Some typical provisions in a collectively bargained contract include establishment and administration of the agreement, functions, rights, and responsibilities, and wage determination and administration. Provisions also include sections on job or income security and plant operations. Finally, collectively bargained contracts typically also incorporate paid and unpaid leave, employee benefit plans, and sections on special groups. Before engaging in bargaining, managers must prepare for negotiations. This involves reviewing the old contract, understanding changes in the market, and predicting what will be potential causes of conflict in the negotiation process. Managers have to think carefully about how to meet the organization's needs while also trying to satisfy the unions. Managers should also take time thinking about the language they'll use in negotiations. I've seen negotiations hampered by perceptions that representatives of the organization were disrespectful to employees in negotiations. In negotiations, both sides will present proposals and then they'll work to reach an agreement. It's in the best interest of all parties to reach an agreement. If they fail to reach an agreement, it's possible that there could be a work stoppage. One type of work stoppage is a strike, and this is where the union decides that union members will not go back to work until their demands are met. Now, members of the union have to vote to authorize the strike, and typically employees don't want to go on strike because when they're not working, they're not being paid. Some factors that often contribute to employees deciding to go on strike are feeling that they're not being respected in negotiations or that the organization is not negotiating in good faith. Alternatively, employers can initiate a lockout or a situation where employees aren't allowed to come to work until certain conditions are met. Typically, a lockout is initiated when the employer feels that their needs are not being met by the current employment arrangement. Sometimes, to avoid a work stoppage, employers and the union will agree to engage in mediation, fact-finding, or arbitration. When they engage in mediation, a mediator, who should be a neutral party, will hear both sides of the situation and try to help facilitate an agreement. The mediator has no authority, however, to impose terms. A fact finder also hears both sides of the situation and sometimes will recommend a solution, but once again, they can't enforce terms either. An arbitrator, however, will hear both sides and determine a binding settlement. So when the organization and the union go into arbitration, they go into it knowing that they may reach an agreement that they don't necessarily like. Because once the arbitrator makes a determination, that's what the organization and the union have agreed to go forward with. Once an agreement is met, the union is responsible for contract administration, or ensuring that the terms of the agreement are carried out the way that they're supposed to be. Okay, often this involves resolving conflicts over how the contract actually reads. Sometimes the union, the employees, and the employer will have different interpretations of language, and the union will work to help resolve these different interpretations. Part of that process is going through a grievance. Okay, and this is a formal process where when an employee feels that the contract is not being honored, that the union, typically the steward, will work with the employee and the employer to help resolve the issue. The grievance process typically starts with the employee and the union steward having a conversation with the manager about the issue at hand. And hopefully we can come to an agreement at this stage in the process. But if we're unable to satisfy the concerns of the employee, the union may decide to file a formal grievance, where they'll submit the grievance in writing to a lower level manager. Management will then respond in writing. If that meets the needs of the employee or if the union is satisfied with the response, then the grievance procedure will be done at this point. If the union is not satisfied, however, they can escalate this by appealing to a top level manager. Okay, management will once again respond in writing to the union, and if the needs of the union or the needs of the employee are not met and the union is not satisfied, then at that point the union can make the decision to go to arbitration. If the grievance goes to arbitration, an impartial party will hear the case and make a determination as to how the situation is going to be handled. That determination will be binding. Both the union and the employer will have agreed to follow whatever determination the arbitrator makes. Now, a lot of what we've talked about here in this lesson makes it sound like unions and the employers are not on the same side. Okay, and traditionally, both sides were viewed as adversaries. But a more contemporary approach to looking at labor management sees cooperation between the unions and the employer, as both parties recognize that they cannot succeed without each other. As we close out this lesson, we're also going to recognize that while unions may be the most recognizable form of representation for employees in the workplace, they're not the only form. Okay, some other forms of representation are management established systems where employees will be given representatives who can meet with management or may serve on committees to help with certain decision-making processes. And sometimes unions are supportive of management established systems in the workplace, but also sometimes management established systems can be used to give employees the perception that they do have some say in the decision-making process and help decrease perceptions that unions are necessary in the workplace. Okay, there are also worker centers that are nonprofit organizations that offer member services such as training, legal advice, lobbying, and worker advocacy. Now, these are a lot of the same types of services that unions offer, but they don't require the same type of formation process. So the worker centers are there, and employees can go take advantage of the worker centers, but they don't have to vote on whether or not the worker center is going to be representative of the organization. So worker centers work a little bit differently. All right, that's it for this lesson. Yes, it's time to say goodbye. Thanks so much for joining me here. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. This is Billy Obenauer here saying I'll talk to you soon.